Greetings. This is Thomas Caldwell. I'm the author of the Aurelian Column, which is a journalistic endeavor I have been involved in since I started it back in 2017. Recently it's gone through a reboot, courtesy of Substack and a few other social media outlets. This is the first podcast. It's a very simple production for someone who's been involved in broadcast radio, and there will be more sophisticated ones. But I thought I would just give a brief introduction as to who I am, where I've been, and hopefully what I can contribute to the current state of affairs. I'm walking and standing very near the statue of Stonewall Jackson on the battlefield of Manassas, otherwise known as the battlefield of Bull Run. For those of you not familiar with American history, this is the site of the first major engagement of the Civil War, which ran from 1861 to 1865, and in spite of the oversimplification of many of our history teachers and history books, there was more to it than just slavery that was trying to be decided. It was a very complicated conflict, as all conflicts involving large-scale military operations are. I said the Civil War, and if things keep going in the United States the way they are, eventually it will be referred to as the First Civil War. Now, I'm not a retired journalist, because journalists really never retire, although some like to say they do. They're always going to be interested in the news and the goings-on of the times they're alive in. I was a correspondent, mostly in the Far East, broadcast correspondent and wire correspondent for an organization called United Press International, which was a major news agency at one point. That was in the later 20th century. And that was also when journalism meant something. I've sadly seen that once noble profession decay into what we're seeing today, and I won't dwell on that. I'd rather think of what it can be. A journalist is just that, someone who keeps a journal, someone who journalizes the times he or she live in. Just like a correspondent is a person who corresponds. He traditionally would write letters and send them out to various publications that would be sent out to their readers. We do live in a different age now, where people think that someone who sits down and reports on things does it for free. A lot of people do, but I can assure you, for someone that did it for a living for some years, it is a very labor-intensive, mentally intensive business, and very blue-collar too. Anyway, radio was something I was very, very, very well known for back in the day. In fact, it's a pretty safe bet that if you were old enough to listen to news radio during the 1990s, you heard me on more than one occasion. I'm back, much of it out of necessity, but also out of love, because I don't see many people actually looking at the truth, looking at what we're going through right now. The world around us, as well as the United States. Now, people have asked me, where'd you get the name Aurelian Column? Well, I come from a time where we read books more than watched television. In fact, reading books is still the best place to get information. And if you don't watch TV, and I haven't owned one in many a year, let alone looked at one, If you read a lot of books, you can learn a lot of stuff. But the name Aurelian column comes from Marcus Aurelius, who was a Roman emperor, a philosopher king of sorts, who wrote on the subject of Stoicism. In fact, Marcus Aurelius's book Meditations, which was written nearly 2 millennia ago, is still one of the best books out there if you want to learn to live a decent and moral life. And in Rome, there is a tall column, a physical column that depicts his exploits, and a column also being a place where a journalist correspondent would put down commentary and analysis. And there is a difference between commentary analysis and just your own opinion on things. It was a bit of a play on words. And it's one I like. Now, I'm here on this battlefield, not just because I live in the general area of Northern Virginia at present, but because it's a place that was once a site of a horrible, bloody conflict. Actually, 2 horrible, bloody conflicts. There were 2 battles of Manassas and Bull Run. But now it's just a peaceful, beautiful field, and you'd never know what went on here all those decades, a century and a half ago. It's also a good example of learning one's lesson. Now, I'm very fortunate at a personal level to have had a father who had children late in life, because I was able to tap into a certain corporate memory. He actually knew real Civil War veterans when he was a kid growing up in the 1930s. There were still plenty of them around, and they would go over to schools and talk about their experiences. And the thing he taught me when I was young, he said, each and every one of them that would come and have a class discussion or talk about history, that was a very interesting time because we used to invite people into classrooms who experienced things. But he told me, he said, not one of them thought that the Civil War was a good idea or glorious. They may have gotten together for their reunions and considered it that, but they all said that it was a very bad idea, that we should have figured it out, talked it out. Because when a country goes into not compromising or not coming up with a solution, bad things can happen. 2% of the American population died in the first Civil War. 2%. That's a lot. You just look at the population today and take 2% out of that, and that's what they had to deal with. Now, this is just an introductory podcast to say hello and to lay the foundation of where I'm going to go. There's too many of the podcasts out there that last for awful long periods of time. I mean, amazingly, hours and hours of people just babbling. Where I was trained by some real experts to tell any story in 1 minute or less, no matter how complex or how detailed. So expect to hear very, very brief reports from me as this podcast progresses. There will be some interviews with people who are interesting, may or may not be telling the truth, but will also be possibly explaining things that are going on behind the scenes. And if you've been watching my Substack channel, you will see that I do write on various topics, and I'm also into poetry. And at some point, you'll be seeing some of my literature. I've been a professional writer on and off for many years and have written just about any sort of document you can imagine and gotten paid for it. But the one thing that's needed is that the purpose of what needed to be understood is the purpose of a journalist is to convey information so that other people can make decisions. When I was starting off in broadcast radio, it was drilled into me, when I was what we call a young cub, saying, you realize, Mr. Caldwell, that you're going to be talking to 35 million people at a time or more. And people are going to make life decisions based on what you tell them. They're going to decide whether or not to take a job, whether or not to move to a new city, possibly even whether or not to marry somebody, depending on what you're telling them. So you better be damn sure it's as accurate as you can get. And also, if it's not specifically certain that it's true, you got to let them know that. You're there to go through all the information to let them know what they have to deal with so they can get on with their day. That's a lesson I never forgot, and it's a lesson that I doubt very much many so-called modern journalists are taught. But that's what you're going to be getting from me. Anyway, the sun's coming up here in Manassas. I'm in front of the Thomas J. Jackson statue, erected pretty much at the spot where he earned his nickname, Stonewall, which meant that he wasn't going to give way. Now, the other thing, too, that's also I'm going to close with here is when it comes to conflicts, there's usually good and bad on both sides of them, especially when it comes to political issues. This is something that the United States used to stand for, is finding a solution. President Theodore Roosevelt won the Nobel Prize for coming up with a peace treaty between the Empire of Japan and Imperial Russia that ended the Russo-Japanese War. And he considered that one of his greatest accomplishments. Solving conflicts is always a far more honorable profession than contributing to them. And hopefully the information I'll be collecting, passing on, will be stuff that will make you think, and, with hope, make you act. And that's about it. This is my introduction. Thomas Caldwell, your humble correspondent for the Aurelian Column. If you wish to contact me, you can do so through my website or Substack. And also I urge you to subscribe to this podcast and to my written material. And if you see it in your heart to contribute so that I can continue with this endeavor, that would also be greatly appreciated. Thank you, and signing off for now.